She was kicked out at 20 with nothing but a duffel bag and $1 to her name. So she did something crazy. She bought an abandoned riverboat office with it. Inside, she found thousands of dollars, but the real question is, why didn't she leave when she had the chance? If this story meant something to you, a like or subscribe really does help the channel. And if you know someone who needs this, feel free to share it with them. I'm always curious, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it over there? She was 20 years old when she learned how quietly a life can fall apart. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic ending the way people imagine when they think about being thrown out. Just a duffel bag sitting on the front porch, packed neatly with the kind of care that makes it worse, and a small folded note that said everything without really saying anything at all. By the time the sun started going down, the house she had lived in for 6 years was no longer hers to walk back into. She stood there for a while, longer than she would ever admit, not because she thought the door might open again, but because leaving meant accepting that there was nowhere else to go. And when she finally picked up the bag, it wasn't with anger or even sadness, but with a kind of quiet understanding that something in her life had shifted, and there was no one coming to fix it for her. She didn't cry as she walked. That part surprises people later, but it makes sense if you understand the kind of life she had grown up in. Her father had always said that some people carry their storms on the outside, and some learn to keep them tucked away where no one can see. She had learned early which kind she was. So instead of crying, she focused on practical things: the weight of the bag on her shoulder, the rhythm of her steps on the sidewalk, the way the air felt colder than it should have for that time of year. She counted blocks without realizing she was doing it, like it might lead her somewhere that made sense. 11 blocks later, she found herself standing in front of the only place that still felt remotely safe, the laundromat where she worked part-time. The one with the flickering fluorescent lights and the steady hum of machines that never really stopped. The woman who owned it didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. There's a certain look people get when they've run out of options, and it's hard to miss once you've seen it enough times. Instead, she locked the front door early, flipped the sign to closed, and told her to sit down. A plate of food appeared without ceremony, followed by a glass of sweet tea that had probably been sitting in the fridge all day. They didn't talk much while she ate. They didn't have to. Sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is not force you to explain something you're still trying to understand yourself. When she finished, the older woman simply said there was a cot in the storage room, and that she could stay as long as she needed. No conditions, no timeline, no speech about responsibility or next steps, just a place to sleep. And in that moment, that was more valuable than anything else she could have been given. The nights that followed were quieter than she expected. The storage room was small, barely enough space for the cot and her bag, but there was something steady about it. The dryers on the other side of the wall ran late into the night, a low constant hum that felt oddly comforting, like the distant sound of engines moving through water. She hadn't realized how much silence had been weighing on her, until it was replaced with something consistent. Sleep came easier than it had in months, maybe years. Not because things were better, but because for the first time in a long while, she didn't have to pretend they were. During the day, she worked. Not just because she needed the money, though she did, but because work gave her something to hold on to. Folding laundry, wiping down machines, counting out small bills at the register, none of it was glamorous, but it was real, and it was hers to do. Every dollar she earned felt different now. It wasn't just spending money or something to tuck away for later. It was proof that she could still move forward, even if she didn't know exactly where she was going. She started saving more carefully than before, keeping track of every expense in a small notebook she found in the back room. It wasn't much, but it was something, and right now something was enough. Still, there was a question that lingered in the background of everything she did, one she couldn't quite shake: what comes next? The cot in the storage room wasn't a permanent solution, and she knew it. The older woman had been generous, but generosity has its limits, even when it isn't spoken out loud. She needed a plan, or at least the beginning of one. So on the nights when the laundromat was empty and the machines had slowed to a stop, she would sit at the small folding table with an old laptop and search for anything that might resemble an opportunity. Cheap apartments, rooms for rent, Seasonal work, most of it was either too expensive or too far away or required something she didn't have. It would have been easy to give up, to accept that she was stuck exactly where she was. But there was a part of her, small but persistent, that refused to settle for that. One night, almost by accident, she typed in something different. Not apartments or jobs, but cheap property. She didn't expect much. Maybe a rundown trailer or a piece of land no one wanted. What she found instead was a listing so strange it didn't feel real at first. A former riverboat landing office, abandoned for decades, scheduled for demolition, available for exactly $1. She read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding something. It sounded ridiculous. It probably was. But there was something about it that stuck with her. Something she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the idea of owning something, anything, even if it was broken. Maybe it was the fact that no one else seemed to want it. Or maybe it was just that for the first time since she had been standing on that porch with her duffel bag, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a while, a possibility. She didn't decide right away. That's the part people get wrong when they look back on stories like this. They imagine a sudden, fearless leap, a moment of clarity where everything just makes sense. But real decisions rarely work like that. She went back and forth for days, weighing the risks, listing out everything that could go wrong. It was far away. It had no utilities. It might be unsafe. It might be a complete waste of the little money she had left. All of that was true. But so was something else. Staying where she was, doing nothing, wasn't really a choice either. Eventually, it came down to a simple question: if she was going to struggle either way. Did she want to struggle for something that might become hers? The answer, when it came, was quieter than she expected. Not a burst of confidence or a dramatic declaration, just a steady, grounded kind of certainty. The kind that doesn't promise success, only that the attempt is worth making. And for someone who had just lost everything familiar, that was enough. She didn't tell anyone right away. Not Pearl, not anyone who might try to talk her out of it. The idea felt too fragile, like something that would fall apart if she said it out loud too soon. So instead, she kept it to herself for a couple of days, going back to that listing every night after her shift. Reading the same short paragraph over and over, like there might be something hidden between the lines she had missed the first 10 times. Former riverboat landing office, abandoned, scheduled for demolition. And then, almost as an afterthought, troop minimum bid 1. It didn't make sense, not really. Nothing that cheap ever came without a catch, and this one had plenty. No power, no plumbing, no guarantee the structure was even safe to step inside. But the more she looked at it, the more it stopped feeling like a bad idea and started feeling like the only idea she had that was actually hers. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It happened on a slow afternoon when the laundromat was nearly empty. Just the hum of 2 dryers and the soft rattle of coins dropping into a machine somewhere in the back. She was wiping down a folding table when Pearl walked over, poured herself a cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter like she had something on her mind. "You've been thinking about something," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Cora hesitated for a second, then pulled out her phone and showed her the listing. Pearl didn't react right away. She adjusted her glasses, read it once, then again, slower this time. "Olmsted," she said quietly, like the word meant something to her. Then she looked up. "I remember hearing about that place. Old landing point. Been gone a long time." There was no immediate warning, no lecture about how reckless it sounded. Just a long pause, and then, "You thinking about going to see it?" Cora nodded. "Then you should go," Pearl said, simple as that. "You don't learn much by staying in the same place." That was all it took. Not permission, not encouragement exactly, but the absence of doubt from someone who had every reason to be cautious. 2 days later, she used what little money she had left to buy a bus ticket. It wasn't a comfortable trip. Greyhound seats rarely are, and this one smelled faintly of old upholstery and something she couldn't quite place. The bus was half full. A mix of people who looked like they were heading somewhere specific and others who seemed like they were just moving, because staying wasn't an option. She kept her bag close, resting it against her legs, one hand looped through the strap even when she dozed off for short stretches. Outside the window, the landscape shifted slowly from small town streets to long stretches of flat farmland. The kind that looks endless in winter when everything has gone dull and quiet. She watched it all pass by, not really thinking, just letting the motion of the bus carry her forward. The last stop dropped her off at a place that barely felt like a town. A single road, a few scattered buildings, most of them closed or looking like they hadn't been used in years. The air was colder out here, sharper somehow, and the wind carried the kind of dampness that comes from being close to a large body of water. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and started walking, following the directions she had scribbled down earlier. It was farther than she expected. 3 miles doesn't sound like much until you recarrying everything you own, and the road stretches on without much change in scenery. By the time she reached the township office, her shoulder ached and her hands were numb from the cold. But she kept her expression steady when she pushed the door open. The woman behind the desk looked up immediately, like she had been expecting someone. Maybe she had. "You hear about the landing office," she said before Cora could speak. Again, not a question. Cora nodded. The woman leaned back in her chair, studying her for a moment. "You know what you were looking at?" she asked. "That building's been empty since the 50s. No utilities, roof's not in great shape. County's planning to burn it come spring." Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was direct, the kind of honesty that doesn't soften things for comfort. "Yes, ma'am," Cora said. "I read the listing." The woman tapped a pen lightly against the desk. "And you still came all this way." Another pause. "You got the dollar." It almost felt like a test. Cora reached into her pocket and pulled out a single bill, slightly worn from being folded too many times. She placed it on the desk, not dramatically, just carefully, like it mattered. The paperwork was surprisingly simple. A few signatures, a stamped document, a key that looked older than anything she had ever owned. Just like that, it was hers. No ceremony, no moment where it suddenly felt real. If anything, it felt strangely ordinary. Like she had just completed an errand instead of making a decision that would likely shape the rest of her life. The woman handed her the key and nodded toward the door. "It's about a mile down that road, then left at the gravel turn-off. You will see it." She hesitated, then added, "Most folks wouldn't do what you were doing." Cora didn't know how to respond to that, so she just said, "I guess I'm not most folks," and stepped back outside. The walk to the property felt different. Heavier, maybe. Not because the distance had changed, but because now there was something waiting at the end of it. The gravel road crunched under her boots as she turned off the main path, and the sound of the river reached her before she could see it, a low, constant movement that filled the silence in a way that felt almost alive. When the building finally came into view, she stopped without meaning to. It was worse than she had imagined, and somehow also exactly what she expected. The structure leaned slightly, the wood faded and worn, parts of the roof sagging where time had done its work without interruption. The old dock was gone, nothing left but a few broken posts sticking out of the water below the bluff. It should have felt like a mistake, like confirmation that she had made the wrong choice. But it didn't. Not entirely. There was something about the way it stood there, quiet and forgotten, that didn't feel empty. It felt unfinished. Like a sentence that had been cut off before it reached its end. She took a few steps forward, the boards of the porch creaking under her weight, and held the key in her hand for a moment before using it. It was colder than she expected, the metal pressing against her skin as she slid it into the lock. For a second she wondered if it would even turn. If it didn't, that would be a sign, wouldn't it? A clear, undeniable reason to walk away. But the lock clicked open with a soft, almost reluctant sound, and just like that, the possibility of turning back disappeared. She pushed the door open slowly, half expecting the whole thing to give way under the pressure. It didn't. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something deeper, something that had settled into the walls over decades. Dust covered most surfaces, but not in a way that felt abandoned so much as undisturbed. She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her, and for the first time since she had left that porch with her duffel bag, she felt something shift again. Not relief, not certainty. Just a quiet, steady awareness that whatever came next would be because she chose to walk into this room instead of away from it. She didn't rush it. That's the part people don't usually expect. You'd think finding something hidden in a place like that would feel urgent. Like she'd start pulling things apart the second she stepped inside. But she didn't. She walked slowly through the room first, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light coming in through the tall windows, taking in the details like they mattered. The desk at the far end caught her attention almost immediately, not because it was in good shape, but because it wasn't. Everything else in the room looked like it had been left behind. The desk looked like it had been left in the middle of something. The roll top was closed, but not locked, and there was a stool tucked slightly off-center, like someone had stood up in a hurry and never sat back down. She set her bag near the wall and moved toward it, brushing a thin layer of dust aside with the back of her hand before resting her palm on the wood. It felt solid old but not weak. When she rolled the top open, it slid back smoother than it had any right to after all those years, and that alone made her pause. Inside, things were still arranged with a kind of quiet order: pencils in a cup, a dried ink well, stacks of old cards that had curled slightly at the edges. It didn't feel abandoned, it felt preserved. Like the room had been waiting for someone to come back and pick up where things left off. The cabinet behind the desk was smaller than she expected. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. 2 wooden doors, a simple brass latch, and a tiny padlock that looked more decorative than secure. She hesitated for a second before touching it, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect. Whoever had closed that cabinet had meant for it to stay that way. But time had already made the decision for her. The lock gave with almost no effort, the metal brittle from years of disuse, and she found herself holding the broken pieces in her hand before she even realized what had happened. Inside, there were only 3 things. That was what made it strange. Not clutter, not forgotten junk, just 3 items placed carefully on a single shelf like they had been chosen for a reason. She took them out one at a time and set them on the floor where the light was better. The first was a logbook, leather-bound, worn at the corners but still intact. When she opened it, the pages made that soft, dry sound old paper always does, and the handwriting inside was neat in a way you don't see much anymore. Each line recorded something: dates, times, names of boats, river conditions. It was detailed, consistent, almost obsessive. She flipped through a few pages, not reading everything, just getting a sense of it. And then something caught her eye. A name she recognized, not immediately, but enough to make her slow down and go back. Her grandfather. The name sat there in ink that had faded but not disappeared, written by someone who had no idea that decades later, a girl standing in an abandoned building would recognize it. She traced it lightly with her finger, not quite touching the page, just following the shape of the letters. It wasn't just a record anymore, it was proof. Proof that this place, this random, forgotten building she had bought for $1, had been part of something connected to her long before she ever knew it existed. That realization didn't come all at once. It settled in slowly, like something finding its place. The second item was a tin box. It wasn't locked, which somehow made it feel more intentional. Like whoever had put it there wasn't trying to hide it. Just protect it from being disturbed too soon. When she opened it, she expected papers, maybe old receipts or documents. What she didn't expect was money. Not a few bills tucked away and forgotten, but stacks organized, bundled, the kind of careful saving that only happens over years. She didn't touch it right away. Just stared for a second, trying to process what she was looking at. It didn't feel real. It felt like the kind of thing you hear about in stories and assume is exaggerated. But it was there, solid and quiet, sitting in a box that had probably been closed longer than she'd been alive. When she finally did reach in, she handled it slowly, almost cautiously, like moving too fast might somehow undo it. The bills were old, but not unusable. Preserved well enough to still hold their value, maybe even more. She didn't count it immediately. That wasn't the point, not yet. What mattered was the fact that it existed at all. Someone had put it there deliberately. Not lost, not forgotten, left. And that difference mattered more than the amount. The envelope was the last thing she opened, and by then, she already had a sense that whatever was inside would explain the rest. It was sealed with wax that had hardened but not cracked, and breaking it felt like crossing some invisible line. The paper inside was thicker than she expected, the handwriting the same as the logbook, steady, practiced. The kind that comes from years of writing the same way every day. She read it once, slowly, then again more carefully, letting each sentence land. It wasn't dramatic, no grand declarations, no attempt to make it sound more important than it was. Just a man explaining his life in simple terms, how long he had worked there, what the place had meant to him, why he had saved the money instead of trusting it to a bank. And then, almost casually, he said he was leaving it for whoever came next. Not because they deserved it, not because they had earned it, but because someone eventually would. And when that person showed up, they would need it more than he ever could. She sat there for a long time after finishing it, the letter resting loosely in her hands. It would have been easy to focus on the money, to see it as a solution, a way out of everything she had been dealing with. And part of her did, at least for a moment. It would have been enough to leave, enough to get a small apartment somewhere, start over in a place where no one knew her story. That option was real, sitting right in front of her. But the letter complicated things. Because it made it clear that the money wasn't just money. It was something carried forward, something meant to continue, not just be used up and gone. She looked around the room again, but differently this time. Not as a place she had ended up in by accident, but as something that had been passed on, intentionally or not. The desk, the logbook, the cabinet, it all felt connected now, like pieces of a story that hadn't ended, just paused. And somehow, without anyone saying it directly, she understood that stepping into that story came with a choice. Not a dramatic life or death kind of choice, but a quieter one. She could take what had been left and walk away, or she could stay and figure out what it meant to carry it forward. For the first time since she found the box, she counted the money. Not because she needed to know exactly how much, but because it felt like part of accepting it. The number mattered less than the weight of it. The reality that someone had spent years building this small reserve of security and then decided to let it go. That kind of decision doesn't happen casually. It comes from a certain way of seeing the world, one that assumes someone else will come along and need help, even if you will never meet them. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, not out of habit, but out of respect. Then she sat back, resting her hands on her knees, and let the quiet of the room settle around her again. Nothing had changed on the surface. The building was still worn down, the roof still needed work, and she was still a 20-year-old with no real plan. But something underneath all of that had shifted. She wasn't just standing in a place she had bought. She was standing in something that had been left unfinished, waiting for someone willing to take it on. And for the first time, the question in her mind wasn't "what do I do now?" but something a little more specific, a little more grounded. It was, "what do I do with this?" The money didn't fix things. That was the first truth she had to sit with, and it came faster than she expected. For a brief moment, standing there with that tin box open in front of her, it had felt like everything might suddenly become easier. Not perfect, not solved, but at least manageable. But when she looked up from the floor and really saw the place again, the sag in the roofline, the cracked window panes, the way the back porch leaned just slightly too far to one side, that feeling didn't hold. If anything, it shifted into something heavier. Because now she knew she had a chance, and that meant she also had something to lose. She started with the roof, mostly because it was the most obvious problem. You don't need experience to know that if water gets in, everything else gets worse fast. The first time she climbed up there, she nearly turned back halfway. Not out of fear exactly, but because the reality of what she was trying to do hit her all at once. This wasn't patching up a room or fixing a broken shelf. This was structural. This was the kind of work people trained for. But there was no one else there, and hiring someone wasn't an option she could afford, not yet. So she stayed, steadying herself against the edge, moving slowly, figuring it out one piece at a time. She made mistakes. More than she liked to admit. Hammered nails in the wrong place, misjudged the angle of a board, had to pull things apart and redo them more than once. But the roof didn't collapse, and by the end of the first week, it wasn't leaking in the places it had before. That counted for something. The money helped, but not in the way people imagine. It wasn't a solution. It was a buffer. It meant she could buy materials without having to choose between that and eating. It meant she could drive into town and pick up what she needed instead of trying to improvise everything from scraps. But every time she spent some of it, she felt it. Not guilt exactly, but awareness. This wasn't money she had earned. It had been handed forward, and that made each decision carry a little more weight. She kept track of everything, writing it down in the same notebook she had used back at the laundromat. Nails, boards, sealant, tools she didn't have before. Each line was a reminder that this wasn't endless. That whatever she built here had to justify what she was using. There were days it didn't feel worth it. Days when the wind came off the river so sharp it cut through her jacket. When her hands ached from the cold, and the work didn't seem to make a visible difference. One afternoon, after spending hours trying to fix the back porch supports, she stepped back to look at it and realized it still leaned. Not as much as before, but enough that anyone else would notice. She stood there longer than she needed to, staring at something that was better but not good enough. And for the first time since she had arrived, she let herself think it clearly. This might have been a mistake. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't come with tears or anger. Just a quiet, steady doubt that settled in and stayed for a while. What she hadn't expected was how visible she would be. This place felt isolated, but it wasn't invisible. People knew about it. More specifically, they knew about her. The first time someone pulled up in a truck while she was working, she froze for a second, unsure what to expect. The man who stepped out didn't introduce himself right away. He just looked around, taking in the structure, the tools, her standing there with a hammer in her hand, like she was still deciding whether she belonged. "You the one who bought this place?" he asked. She nodded. He didn't smile, didn't frown either. Just gave a small, almost thoughtful nod and said, "Gonna take more than a weekend." Then he got back in his truck and left. Encounters like that became more common. Some people were curious, some skeptical, a few quietly supportive in ways that didn't draw attention to themselves. A man dropped off a stack of old lumber one morning without knocking, just left it near the porch and drove away. Another stopped by and pointed out a problem with her foundation she hadn't noticed yet, then showed her how to reinforce it using what she already had. No one made a big deal out of helping. That was the thing she started to understand about this place. Kindness wasn't announced. It was offered in pieces, practical and unspoken, the way you hand someone a tool without asking if they need it. But not everything was supportive. There were voices too quiet at first, then a little louder. Questions about whether she had the right to be there, whether the county had made a mistake selling it, whether she was actually going to follow through or just leave it half. Finished like everything else that had been abandoned out here. None of it was said directly to her face, not at first. It came through tone, through side conversations that stopped when she got close, through looks that lingered just long enough to be noticed. It would have been easy to let that get under her skin. Some days it did. Especially when the work wasn't going well and the doubts she already had found something to attach themselves to. The hardest part wasn't the physical labor, though that was constant. It was the stretch of time where nothing felt finished, where every improvement uncovered something else that needed fixing, where progress existed but didn't feel like progress because the end was still so far out of reach. She started to understand why the place had been left the way it was. Not because no one cared, but because caring wasn't always enough to carry something this heavy all the way through. There were nights she lay on that cot in the back room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through gaps she hadn't sealed yet, and wondered how long she could keep doing this before something gave out her energy, her money, or just her willingness to keep choosing the harder path. But every morning she got up and kept going, not because she felt inspired, but because stopping would mean facing the same question she had avoided back in the laundromat: what comes next? Here, at least, she had an answer even if it was a difficult one. Fix the next thing, then the next. Learn what you don't know. Accept help when it comes, even if it's not offered in a way you recognize right away. And maybe most importantly, stop expecting it to feel easy just because it matters. The money sat in the background of all of this, not as a solution, but as a quiet partner in the process. It bought her time. It gave her a margin to make mistakes and recover from them. But it didn't swing the hammer for her. It didn't climb the roof or brace the beams or stand there in the cold when things weren't working the way she hoped they would. That part was still hers, and somewhere in the middle of all that effort, something subtle started to shift again. The place didn't just look different. It started to feel different. Less like something she had found, and more like something she was building. And that distinction, small as it sounds, changed everything. At some point, the work stopped feeling like something she was trying to finish and started feeling like something she was choosing to continue. It's a subtle shift, but it matters. In the beginning, every board, every long day out in the cold had been tied to a goal: fix the roof, stabilize the porch, make the place livable. But somewhere along the way, without her really noticing when it happened, the urgency faded just enough to make room for something else. Routine. Not the kind that traps you, but the kind that steadies you. She started waking up before sunrise, not because she had to, but because the quiet of that hour felt like it belonged to her. The river would still be half hidden in the morning fog, the air sharp and clean, and for a few minutes before the day really began, everything felt still in a way that didn't exist anywhere else. The stove had been one of the last things she got working properly. It took longer than she expected, cleaning out years of buildup, figuring out how to get a consistent burn, learning the small adjustments that made the difference between a weak flame and something that would actually hold heat. The first morning she managed to get it going without trouble. She stood there longer than necessary, just watching the flame settle into something steady. It wasn't impressive. It didn't change anything in a big, visible way. But it was hers, a small, working system in a place that had been broken for decades. Without really planning to, she filled a kettle with water and set it on top. She remembered the letter then, not all of it, just one line about coffee, about how it had never been part of the job, but it had mattered anyway. At the time, it had felt like a detail, something that added character to the man who wrote it. But standing there in the early light, listening to the faint sound of the kettle starting to warm, it felt different. Less like a detail and more like a decision. Something small, repeatable, easy to dismiss, and exactly because of that, worth keeping. So she made coffee. Not for anyone in particular. There was no line out the door, no expectation that someone would show up and need it. She poured a cup and sat at the desk, the same one that had been there long before she arrived, and watched the river move past like it always had. For a while that was all it was, a quiet habit, something she did because it felt right, even if she couldn't fully explain why. The first time someone else walked in, it caught her off guard. She heard the door before she saw him, the sound of it opening slow, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there. He stood just inside, looking around in that way people do when they're trying to match what they see with what they expected. Older, maybe late 60s, wearing a jacket that had seen more seasons than it should have. Didn't think this place was open again. He said more to himself than to her. She didn't stand up right away. Just turned slightly in her chair and said, "It's not, really." He nodded like that made sense, then noticed the cup in her hand, the kettle still sitting on the stove. "You got coffee?" he asked. She hesitated for half a second. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because the moment felt bigger than the question. Then she said, "Yeah, I do." And just like that, something shifted. She poured him a cup without asking how he took it. He didn't complain. Just wrapped his hands around it and stood there for a moment before sitting down across from her like it was the most natural thing in the world. They didn't talk much, a few questions, a few answers. He had worked the river years ago. Knew the place back when it still mattered. Said it felt strange seeing it like this again. Then, after finishing his coffee, he set the cup down carefully and said, "Good of you to keep that going," before heading back out the way he came. That moment stayed with her longer than she expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was simple, almost forgettable if you looked at it the wrong way. But it confirmed something she hadn't fully understood until then. This place didn't need to become something new to matter. It just needed to continue being what it had always been, a place where small things counted. More people came after that. Not in crowds, not all at once, but steadily enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence. A truck driver who took a wrong turn and decided to stop when he saw the building. A couple passing through who had heard about the old landing and wanted to see what was left of it. A retired pilot who stood in the doorway longer than anyone else. Eyes moving slowly across the room before settling on the logbook she had placed on the desk. Each of them brought something with them, stories, questions, pieces of a past she hadn't lived but was starting to understand. And each time she made coffee. She didn't charge for it. That thought crossed her mind once or twice, especially on days when money felt tighter than she liked to admit. But it never stuck. Charging would have changed the interaction, turned it into a transaction instead of what it was, a continuation of something that had been freely given before she ever stepped into the room. And that mattered more than a few extra dollars. The place changed slowly but noticeably. Not just in how it looked, though that was part of it. The walls were cleaner, the windows clearer, the structure stronger than it had been when she first arrived. But more than that, it felt occupied in a way it hadn't for a long time. Not busy, not crowded, but alive. There's a difference. It came from the small things, the sound of the door opening and closing, the quiet conversations that happened over cups of coffee, the way people lingered just a little longer than they needed to before leaving. She thought about leaving sometimes. That didn't go away entirely. There were still easier paths available to her, especially now that the place was stable enough to stand on its own. She could have sold it, probably made a decent return on the investment, started over somewhere else with fewer unknowns. That option didn't disappear just because she had built something here. But it lost its pull. Not because it wasn't appealing, but because it didn't feel necessary anymore. One evening, sitting on the front step as the light faded over the river, she found herself thinking back to the day she had been standing on that porch with her duffel bag, unsure of where to go next. At the time, it had felt like an ending. Like something had been taken from her without her having any say in it. But looking at it now from where she was sitting, it didn't feel that way anymore. It felt like a redirection. Not planned, not gentle, but still leading somewhere she might not have chosen on her own. She didn't say that out loud. There was no one there to hear it, and even if there had been, it wasn't the kind of thing she needed to explain. Some understandings don't need to be shared to be real. She just sat there a little longer, listening to the river move in the distance, feeling the weight of the day settle into something quieter. Inside, the kettle sat on the stove, ready for the next morning. And that, more than anything else, felt like the answer she had been looking for all along. Not a grand solution, not a moment where everything suddenly made sense, but a simple, steady rhythm she could return to. Wake up, light the stove, make the coffee, keep the door open, and trust that, somehow that would be enough. Years later, people would ask her why she stayed. Why she didn't take the money and leave when she had the chance. She never gave them a long answer. She would just smile, pour them a cup of coffee, and say, "Because someone once did the same for me, and I figured it was my turn." I think the easiest way to misunderstand this story is to think it's about luck, about a girl who found money at the exact moment she needed it. But if you really listen closely, that's not what stayed with me. What stayed with me is that she still could be left. She still had a way out, and she didn't take it. Because at some point, life stops being about what you were given and starts being about what you decide to do with it. Most of us, at one point or another, will find ourselves standing in that same kind of moment. Maybe not in an abandoned building, maybe not with a box of money, but in a place where things didn't go the way we planned. Where something ended, or someone let us go, or the life we thought we had just quietly slipped out from under us. And in those moments, it's really easy to believe we've been left behind. But what this story reminds me is maybe we haven't been left behind. Maybe we've just been placed somewhere new before we were ready to understand why. She didn't stay because it was easy. She stayed because something about that place broken as it was felt worth building. And I think that's the part we all overlook. We spend so much time looking for the perfect situation, the perfect opportunity, the thing that comes already put together, that we forget some of the most meaningful things in life don't come that way. Sometimes they come unfinished, quiet, a little broken, and they ask something from us before they give anything back. And maybe the real lesson here isn't about the money, or even the place. Maybe it's about the idea that small things matter more than we think. A cup of coffee, a door left open, a decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. Those things don't look like much in the moment, but over time they become something else. They become a life. They become a place where other people can stop, breathe, and feel like they were not alone for a little while. And I guess if there's anything to take from this, it's this. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't need a perfect plan. Sometimes all you need is one place you decide not to walk away from, and the willingness to build something there, one small, quiet choice at a time.